What if I told you that in public education, increasing a local school's budget, significantly raising teacher pay, and shrinking class sizes so kids get more individualized attention could actually cause the high school dropout rate to go up?
Right, which sounds completely backwards.
It totally defies all basic logic. I mean, it goes against everything we are taught about how to fix our schools.
Yeah, it really does.
But according to this landmark piece of economic research out of Harvard, that is exactly what happens the moment a school district unionizes.
And honestly, it is one of the most counterintuitive findings in the history of education economics. We just naturally assume that, injecting more resources into a system automatically produces a better product.
Right, like more money equals better schools.
Exactly. But the data reveals a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. And that's largely because we misunderstand the underlying mechanics of the institutions absorbing those resources.
And that brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are exploring one overarching question. How do unions affect educational expenditures and quality?
Which is a huge topic.
Huge. I mean, when you look at your local public school, you might wonder exactly where your tax dollars are going, right? And why throwing more money at education doesn't always seem to equal better results for the kids.
Yeah, it's a question a lot of parents and taxpayers have.
To figure out why, we really have to look at the massive, complex engine of teachers' unions. And we have a fascinating stack of sources to guide us today.
We really do.
We are pulling insights from a source we'll just call Papa Bear. He's a 30-year veteran teacher in the public education system who has seen the evolution of this landscape from the inside out.
30 years is a long time to see the system shift.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
We're also relying heavily on that landmark Harvard study I mentioned, authored by Caroline Hawksby and published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. She attempted to quantify these effects with rigorous census data.
Right, which is crucial.
And we will also examine arguments from critics of the public school monopoly, including voices like Jordan Peterson and various school choice advocates. And finally, we'll look at the ultimate stress test of contemporary data from the COVID-19 pandemic, alongside a newer organizing strategy called bargaining for the common good.
Well, before we go any further, I want to establish a very clear baseline for you, the listener, because the sources we are examining today contain highly politically charged viewpoints.
No, absolutely.
We are dealing with arguments originating from both sides of the political aisle. I mean, ranging from fierce free market critics to staunch labor advocates.
Right.
So our mission today is purely to impartially unpack these arguments. We are not here to endorse any political ideology, nor are we taking sides on whether unions are inherently a positive or negative force.
Yeah, that's not what this deep dive is about.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly analytical. We are going to look at how these systems function legally, how they incentivize human behavior economically, and what the data actually tells us about their impact on the ground.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the impact of unions, we first have to understand that there is a fundamental ground-level disagreement about what the actual objective of a teachers' union even is.
Right. There are two completely different paradigms here.
Exactly.
Let's start with the stated view of the unions themselves, which we can call the symbiotic model. According to major labor organizations, their primary objective is to use their collective knowledge, their on-the-ground experience, and their bargaining power to extract more resources for education from the government.
From the state and the local levels, right.
Right. And crucially, they argue that they directly use those resources to advance student achievement.
Which makes sense. I mean, the logic is straightforward, right?
Yeah, the union fights for better working conditions, but in education, working conditions are learning conditions.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
So if you give the union more power, they secure more funding, which translates to a better environment for the children. In this model, what is beneficial for the teacher is inherently beneficial for the student.
I mean, that makes intuitive sense on paper. You want the person instructing your child to be well compensated, well rested, and well resourced.
Of course you do.
But then we look at the perspective of our 30-year veteran, Papa Bear. His view, which was, formed over 3 decades inside the classroom, is drastically different.
Very different.
He asserts that the main objective of teachers' unions is solely to enhance the welfare of teachers, with no particular concern for students, parents, administrators, or voters.
And that perspective aligns with what economists call the special interest model. In economic terms, a special interest group seeks to isolate benefits for its specific members, often at the expense of the broader system.
So it's basically a labor monopoly.
Exactly. The veteran teacher's argument is that the union has a legal mandate and a fiduciary duty exclusively to its dues-paying members.
Wow.
So if the special interest model is accurate, the union will successfully extract resources from the taxpayer, but those resources will be absorbed entirely by the adults in the system without necessarily improving the academic outcomes for the children.
It almost sounds like a corporate human resources department. I mean, employees often have to learn the hard way that HR is not actually there to protect the worker, right?
Yeah, that's a classic misconception.
Right. HR is there to protect the company from liability. It's a structural mandate.
Right.
So Papa Bear is arguing that the union's structural mandate is to protect the employee, even if that protection acts as a liability to the overarching mission of the school.
That's a great analogy.
But if we have two completely opposing models, one saying unions are the ultimate champions of student success, and the other saying they are special interest monopolies hoarding resources, how do we measure who is actually right? I mean, we can't just rely on dueling anecdotes from school board meetings.
This raises an important question. We need to move from sociological theory to empirical observation. And that is exactly what Caroline Hawksby attempted to do in her 1996 study.
Right, which is huge.
It remains one of the most rigorous attempts to quantify this divide.
Let's dive into that Hawksby data. What stands out immediately is the sheer scale of the timeline she analyzed. I mean, she utilized census data from public school districts all across the country,
Massive data set.
focusing specifically on the decades surrounding 1970, 1980, and 1990. And she focused her analysis on three main variables:
Which were?
school expenditures, teacher employment and pay, and student enrollment. But I imagine defining what constitutes a unionized school isn't as simple as just asking the teachers if they feel like they are in a union.
Far from it. It has to be a structural, legally binding reality. Hawksby established a strict three-part criteria for a district to be classified as unionized in her data set.
Okay, what were the rules?
First, there had to be a formal contractual agreement between the teachers' organization and the school administration. Second, the negotiations had to take the specific form of collective bargaining. And third, at least 50% of the teachers in that district had to be formal members of the organization.
Okay, so under those stringent rules, the growth of unionization in the public sector is just staggering.
It really is.
Her data showed that the fraction of students enrolled in unionized public school districts was a mere 1% in 1963. But by 1992, it had exploded to 43%.
Right. That is a massive systemic shift in the administration of public education in under 30 years.
It was a total transformation of the labor market.
It was. However, in trying to measure the impact of that transformation, Hawksby ran into a massive scientific hurdle. It's a concept in statistics known as endogeneity.
Well, like if you just look at a struggling school that recently unionized, how do you know the union caused the struggle?
Yes.
Couldn't it be that the teachers decided to unionize because the school was already a total disaster? Underfunded and poorly managed?
That is precisely the hurdle. Economists often refer to this as reverse effects. If a district is chaotic, administrators are hostile, and salaries are stagnant, teachers might unionize as an act of sheer desperation.
Right.
If you simply look at a snapshot of the census data, you might see a unionized school with terrible academic outcomes and blame the union for the mess. But in reality, the mess caused the union.
Separating causality from correlation in that environment is incredibly difficult.
It is.
So how did she untangle that? Because if she can't prove whether the union caused the poor performance or the poor performance caused the union, the entire study falls apart.
Well, she solved it brilliantly by stepping back from the individual districts and analyzing state legislative timelines. She looked at the specific state laws that facilitated the creation of teachers' unions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, in 1960, collective bargaining by public sector teachers was actually illegal in many states. Public employees did not have the same labor rights as private sector industrial workers.
I didn't realize that.
But then the legal landscape began to shift dramatically. By 1970, 23 states had granted teachers the right to engage in some form of collective bargaining.
Okay.
9 more states had done so by 1980, and an additional 5 by 1990.
I see where this is going. By tracking the state laws, she isn't looking at desperate teachers forming unions in bad schools.
Right.
She's looking at what happens to an entire state's educational system the moment a law is passed that allows or forces unions to form statewide.
Exactly. Furthermore, she tracked the legalization of two very specific labor frameworks, agency shops and union shops.
What's the difference there?
Well, an agency shop is a legal framework where the union is permitted to collect dues from all teachers in a bargaining unit, regardless of whether a teacher is actually a member of the union.
Wow.
The logic is that the union bargains on behalf of everyone, so everyone must pay a fair share fee.
Hmm.
A union shop goes a step further. It is an environment where all teachers must literally become union members as a condition of their employment.
So you have to join to work there.
Yep. And these laws were explicitly permitted in 2 states by 1970, 12 more by 1980, and an additional 7 by 1990.
Okay.
By tracking these legislative catalysts, Hawksby could observe the before and after effects of unionization being structurally introduced to a state's school system.
That isolates the variable perfectly. So let's get to her main findings. What happened to the expenditures when a district unionized under these laws?
What did she find?
Hawksby found that unionization raised per-pupil spending by about 12%. That is a massive influx of taxpayer money.
It is.
And roughly 75% of that new, greater spending went directly into two specific areas. Higher teacher salaries, which were estimated to rise by about 5%, and lowering the student-teacher ratio, meaning class sizes dropped by around 2 students per teacher.
Now, if we pause right here, this data point seems to completely validate the union's symbiotic model. I mean, they gained power, they secured 12% more funding, they paid educators a better wage, and they shrunk class sizes.
Yeah, it looks great on paper.
The unions have long argued that higher salaries attract better pedagogical talent, and fewer students per class means more individualized academic intervention. It looks like a resounding victory for the educational environment.
I would argue that any parent looking at those two inputs, better paid teachers in smaller classes, would expect the academic outcomes to skyrocket. I mean, wouldn't you?
Absolutely.
So how did Hawksby measure the actual quality of the education resulting from those inputs?
Because of the limitations of census data across this specific decades, she needed a performance variable that was consistently tracked across every single district.
Right.
The most reliable metric available to measure school quality and systemic failure was the high school dropout rate.
And this brings us to the key result, the paradox I mentioned at the beginning of the deep dive. Despite the 12% increase in per-pupil spending, despite the higher salaries, and despite the smaller classes, Hawksby found that unionization actually raised the dropout rate by an estimated 2.3 percentage points.
Which is wild. It completely shatters the claims of the symbiotic model.
It is baffling. You inject the exact resources that educational experts claim are necessary for success, and the system produces a higher rate of failure.
Yeah.
Where is the money going if it's not reaching the student's academic outcome?
Hawksby concluded that unionization's ill effects operate partly by fundamentally lowering the efficiency of school inputs.
The efficiency.
Right. To prove this, she looked at the non-unionized schools in her data set. In those schools, when student-teacher ratios were lowered and teacher salaries were increased, it actually did lead to better outcomes.
Okay, so it works there.
Yeah, the dropout rates went down, the inputs worked precisely the way we logically expect them to work.
But in the unionized schools?
In the unionized schools, neither the lower student-teacher ratios nor the higher teacher salaries had any detectable positive effect on the dropout rates.
Wow.
The resources just lost their efficacy. Hawksby's data suggests that the unions managed to divert extra school inputs into things that they care about. Specifically, higher teacher pay and the reduced effort required to deal with fewer students, rather than translating those inputs into better student performance.
That creates a bizarre incentive structure.
Yeah.
I mean, if a non-union school gets smaller classes, the administration might say, great, now our teachers have the bandwidth to run after-school tutoring for at-risk kids.
Right.
But if a unionized school gets smaller classes through a collective bargaining agreement, the contract might strictly limit the number of instructional minutes a teacher can work, meaning the extra bandwidth is absorbed purely as adult comfort or reduced workload, rather than redirected toward the failing student.
And that is the essence of the special interest model. Without a structural mechanism linking those improved inputs to accountability for student success, the efficiency of the taxpayer dollar just plummets.
Right, the resources are successfully extracted, but they are trapped within the labor layer of the institution. If Hawksby's data proves that the resources aren't reaching the students, we have to look at the daily machinery of a school to see where those resources are actually getting absorbed.
Yeah, what does a union contract physically dictate inside a building that causes this inefficiency?
Well, our sources point to systemic critiques raised by voices like clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson and various school choice advocates. They argue that teachers' unions create this harm not necessarily out of malice, but because their structural imperative requires them to protect poor performance, resist systemic reforms, and prioritize their own institutional power.
Let's examine the mechanics of that protection, starting with the cornerstone of the union model, tenure.
Yeah, tenure. Most of us know tenure generally means it's hard to fire someone, but the legal mechanics of it in public education are incredibly dense.
They really are.
It's not just a polite professional courtesy, it is an ironclad legal shield.
Exactly. When a teacher achieves tenure, which, by the way, in some states can happen in as little as 2 to 3 years, they are granted immense due process rights.
2 to 3 years, that's so
It
fast.
is. Now, the original intent of tenure was noble. It was designed to protect teachers from arbitrary dismissal or political retribution.
Right.
Like if a teacher taught a scientifically accurate but socially controversial topic, tenure ensured a local politician couldn't simply terminate their employment.
That makes total sense.
However, critics argue that in modern practice, the union's fierce defense of these due process rights has morphed tenure into a shield for gross incompetence.
Because attempting to fire an ineffective tenured teacher becomes a bureaucratic nightmare that administrators simply cannot afford.
Precisely. If a principal wants to fire a tenured teacher for poor performance, they can't just issue a pink slip. They have to navigate a labyrinthine arbitration process.
I've heard about this.
Yeah, in places like New York, these are often referred to as 30-20 hearings. The district must document every infraction meticulously, provide endless remediation plans, and then go before an arbitrator.
Oh, wow.
And the union provides top-tier legal defense for the teacher, entirely funded by union dues. This process can drag on for years and cost a district hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and paid administrative leave just to remove a single poor-performing educator.
Which naturally leads to what the sources call the dance of the lemons. I mean, if a superintendent knows it will cost the district $200,000 and 3 years of administrative headaches to fire an incredibly ineffective teacher, the path of least resistance is just to transfer that teacher to a different school within the district.
Exactly.
They just shuffle the problem around, often dumping the lowest performing teachers into the most disadvantaged, lower income schools that lack the political capital to complain.
And that bureaucratic rigidity extends directly into how teachers are compensated, leading to the second major critique: driving out talent. Collective bargaining agreements almost universally enforce what is known as a step-and-lane salary schedule. This is a grid where your pay is dictated strictly by two metrics: your years of service, which are the steps, and the number of postgraduate academic credits you have accumulated, which are the lanes.
Notice what is entirely missing from that calculation: how well the students are actually learning.
Merit is entirely removed from the equation. Critics argue this creates the widget effect. The contract treats every teacher as an interchangeable widget.
Right.
A 25-year-old, brilliant, highly motivated educator who works relentlessly to innovate their lesson plans and stay late to mentor students will make exactly the same salary as a disengaged educator with the same years of experience who just reads the newspaper at their desk.
It's incredibly demoralizing. I mean, if you're a high-performing young teacher, you quickly realize that excellence is not financially rewarded and baseline survival is guaranteed by tenure. The incentive to go above and beyond is completely stripped away by the contract. Naturally, those high performers often leave public education entirely for the private sector, where their individual merit is recognized and compensated, leaving behind a labor pool that is perfectly content to coast on the protections of the seniority system.
And this is further exacerbated during budget cuts through a policy commonly known as LIFO, or last in, first out.
Right, LIFO.
If a district faces a budget shortfall and has to lay off 10% of its teaching staff, the union contract usually dictates that the newest teachers must be fired first, regardless of their performance evaluations.
That's crazy.
A district could be forced to fire its teacher of the year simply because they were hired recently, while retaining a historically poor-performing teacher who has 20 years seniority.
It is the ultimate prioritization of the adult over the student. And the sources note that research by these critics suggests states with stronger union collective bargaining agreements often see a corresponding decline in long-term student test scores and even the future earning potential of those students.
Which is pretty alarming.
But the union's influence isn't contained to just the inside of the school building. They flex immense political muscle outside the building, specifically when it comes to the battle over school choice. Here's where it gets really interesting.
This is perhaps the most fiercely contested battleground. Teachers' unions aggressively lobby state legislatures to impose strict caps on the number of charter schools allowed to open, and they fight relentlessly against voucher programs and tax credit scholarships.
Which presents a fascinating rhetorical paradox. I mean, if you listen to the public relations messaging of the NEA or the AFT, they frequently position themselves as the ultimate champions of low-income, marginalized, and minority students.
Right, that's their stated mission.
Yet these school choice programs like vouchers are often desperately desired by those exact same low-income families who want a ticket out of a failing neighborhood school. If the union is truly symbiotic with the community, why do they spend millions of dollars fighting against the alternatives those communities are begging for?
Because, from the perspective of the special interest model, school choice represents an existential threat to the union's monopoly on the labor market and its funding stream.
Follow the money.
Exactly. Public education funding typically follows the student. If a student leaves a traditional public school with a voucher to attend a private or charter school, the funding leaves the public district.
Makes sense.
Less money for the district means fewer unionized teaching positions, which ultimately means fewer dues collected by the union. To protect their members' jobs and their institutional power, the union must crush school choice.
Even if crushing school choice means actively trapping vulnerable children in failing institutions. The critics point out that the union acts as a gatekeeper, forcing families to consume a monopolized product regardless of its quality.
And that gatekeeping is funded by mandatory dues, which leads to the final systemic critique, advancing ideological agendas. Opponents argue that major national unions, such as the National Education Association, the NEA, and the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, function less like localized labor representatives and more like national political action committees.
Because they spend so much on politics.
Yeah, they spend tens of millions of dollars in dues on political lobbying and campaign contributions that often focus heavily on progressive political causes entirely unrelated to education.
Critics argue this detracts heavily from the foundational politically neutral skills that schools are mandated to teach, like reading proficiency, mathematical literacy, and scientific inquiry. It inherently alienates parents and taxpayers who might fundamentally disagree with that specific political ideology, but who are effectively forced to fund it through their property taxes, which pay the salaries, which are then garnished for union dues.
So we have established a landscape defined by massive structural rigidities. A system that protects tenure at all costs, pays strictly based on seniority while utilizing last-in, first-out layoff policies, fights tooth and nail against any market alternatives, and utilizes taxpayer-derived funds for partisan political lobbying.
But for a long time, for the average citizen, a lot of this was just invisible background noise.
Yeah, you didn't see it day to day.
Dropped your kid off at school at 8 a.m., they came home at 3:00 p.m., and you didn't really think about the mechanics of a collective bargaining agreement. It was theoretical. Until a global crisis hit, and the theoretical suddenly became very, very real.
A system's true nature, its actual hierarchy of priorities, is really only revealed under extreme stress.
And the COVID-19 pandemic provided the ultimate stress test. It put this exact rigidity, this special interest model, under a brutal global microscope.
The rapid shift to remote online learning during the pandemic is arguably the most significant disruption to public education in modern history. The sources outline severe, documented setbacks for student development during these prolonged lockdowns.
The academic fallout was just catastrophic.
It was. Studies across multiple states found profound drops in reading and math proficiency. And predictably, the hardest hit were the least academically prepared students and the lower income districts.
But the damage went far beyond test scores. We saw a massive rise in chronic absenteeism, virtual learning environments, correlated with massive disengagement.
Yeah, kids just disappearing.
Kids simply stopped logging on, ghosting their classes, completely falling out of the educational system. And the human toll was devastating. Deprived of face-to-face peer interaction and the structured support of an in-person school day, students experienced skyrocketing rates of anxiety, stress, and profound isolation.
Not to mention the physical health issues stemming from sedentary behavior and prolonged screen time.
Right. The damage to the children is an undeniable historical fact. But this deep dive is about understanding the mechanics of the unions. What was their role during this specific crisis?
Well, during the height of the pandemic, teachers' unions wielded unprecedented political influence over school reopening decisions. As early data emerged showing that schools were not primary drivers of transmission, especially for young children, many private schools and public schools across Europe began to safely reopen.
I remember that.
But in the United States, in major urban districts with powerful unions, the primary stance was to advocate for prolonged, indefinite remote instruction.
Citing concerns over poor ventilation in aging buildings and packed classrooms, the union strongly resisted a rapid return. But how exactly did they enforce that resistance? I mean, it wasn't just them suggesting it was a bad idea. They actively forced mayors and governors to keep the doors locked.
They utilized the exact levers of power we discussed in the previous section. They leveraged their massive political campaign contributions to pressure local politicians and health departments. They threatened organized sickouts and illegal strikes.
Wow.
In places like Chicago and Los Angeles, the unions essentially held the reopening of schools hostage to a list of demands that extended far beyond basic PPE.
What kind of demands?
They demanded specific community transmission metrics that were nearly impossible to meet, hazard pay, prioritized vaccine access before the elderly, and in some cases, even tied reopening to broader social justice legislation completely unrelated to public health.
Imagine if the city's sanitation workers or public transit operators unionized during the pandemic and said, "This variant is too hazardous. We are halting the subway system and trash collection indefinitely until zero transmission in the city is guaranteed, and we will work remotely."
Right, which you can't do.
Obviously, you can't drive a bus over Zoom. But transit and sanitation are essential public utilities. Society collapses without them. For decades, public schools positioned themselves as the most essential public utility for a child's development and a parent's ability to participate in the economy.
You did.
But when the crisis hit, the union treated the school not as an essential service, but as a hazardous work site from which their members needed total protection. At what point does protecting the worker harm the public they serve?
It perfectly illustrates the clash between an essential public service and labor protection. If you view this through the symbiotic model, the union was desperately trying to protect the health of the broader community, arguing that if teachers got sick, the system would collapse anyway.
Okay, sure.
But if you view this through the special interest model, the pandemic is the starkest, most undeniable example ever recorded. The union's primary directive was the physical safety and financial compensation of its adult members. During COVID-19, that directive directly collided with the developmental, academic, and psychological needs of the children.
The public expects schools to be open to save the developmental lives of children, just as they expect the power grid to stay on during a storm. But the union said, no, our safety comes first. And that stance resisting swift reopening plans, long after the data suggested it was safe to return, drew immense, sharp criticism from policymakers and exhausted families.
It really shattered the illusion for millions of parents. It proved that when push comes to shove, the union protects the teacher and the student absorbs the cost.
Given this massive clash and the immense, unyielding power unions wielded over local governments during the pandemic, many parents, taxpayers, and even dissident educators began actively seeking ways to balance the scales.
Right.
They realized they were trapped in a monopoly and started looking for the exits.
And our sources provide a literal playbook for this. Our veteran teacher, Papa Bear, outlines 4 primary methods of challenging union dominance. And what's fascinating is how these 4 methods naturally sequence together, attacking the structural power of the union from the financial level to the political level to the professional level, and finally to the state legislative level.
Let's follow that sequence, starting with the financial foundation.
Yeah.
Union dues. The first method involves public employees exercising their legal rights to cut off the union's money supply. This hinges on a massive, landscape-altering Supreme Court case from 2018. Janus v. AFSCME.
Janus fundamentally changed the financial leverage. Before 2018, as we discussed with Hawksby's data on agency shops, if you were a public school teacher in many states, you were forced to pay union fees just to keep your job, even if you hated the union and formally opted out of membership.
Which seems so unfair.
The union argued they bargained on your behalf, so you couldn't be a free rider. You had to pay your fair share. But the Supreme Court ruled that forcing public sector employees to pay these fees violated their First Amendment rights.
And what was the logic there?
The court's logic was that in the public sector, collective bargaining is inherently political. When a teacher's union demands a 10% raise, they are directly lobbying the government to increase taxes or reallocate public budgets.
Right.
Therefore, forcing a teacher to fund that bargaining is forced political speech. Under Janus, A teacher has the absolute constitutional right to resign their union membership and completely cease paying any dues.
But the unions didn't just accept this loss of revenue. I mean, Papa Bear's insights note a crucial, highly tactical detail here: the strict opt-out windows. You would think you could just send an email to payroll and stop your dues, like canceling a subscription.
The unions anticipated the financial hemorrhage, so they wrote incredibly narrow bureaucratic traps into their collective bargaining agreements. They will stipulate, yes, you have the right to opt out, but you can only submit your resignation during a specific 10-day period that occurs exactly on the anniversary of the date you originally signed your union card 15 years ago.
That's ridiculous.
If your letter arrives on day 11, it is rejected, and you are legally trapped paying thousands of dollars in dues for another full year. It is a retention tactic built entirely on bureaucratic friction.
So Janus gives the individual teacher financial leverage. But what about the parents and taxpayers who don't pay dues but still suffer under the monopoly? They have to use political leverage, which leads to the second method: engaging in local school board elections.
This attacks the power dynamic directly at the bargaining table. Who sits across from the union during contract negotiations? The school board. And where do teacher unions get a massive amount of their power?
From the board.
By utilizing their massive war chests of dues to endorse, campaign for, and heavily fund the very candidates who sit on that board.
It is an incredible, almost absurd conflict of interest. The union effectively spends millions of dollars to elect their own bosses, ensuring that the people sitting across the negotiating table are highly sympathetic to the union's demands. It's regulatory capture at the local level.
But the vulnerability of the union, the strategy here, is that they rely heavily on low turnout elections. School board elections are historically held off-cycle, meaning not during a presidential or midterm election year when very few average citizens are paying attention. Right. But the union ensures that every single one of its members votes. A candidate can win a school board seat in a large district with just a few thousand votes.
So the counter strategy is for reform-minded citizens to actually run for the board themselves and to mobilize frustrated parents to treat these hyper-local, seemingly boring elections with the same intensity as a national race.
Exactly.
A mobilized community can outvote the union bloc and elect a board that prioritizes academic performance and fiscal responsibility over union seniority demands.
Now, if the financial leverage of Janus and the political leverage of the school board begin to weaken the traditional union, teachers who want to leave still face a professional dilemma. This brings us to the third method: alternative professional associations.
Many teachers feel trapped because they think, if I leave the NEA or the AFT, I lose my liability insurance. If a kid slips and falls in my classroom, or a parent sues me over a disciplinary issue, I will be personally bankrupt.
That's a huge fear.
That fear of liability is a primary reason many excellent educators stay in the union, even if they despise its political lobbying.
It's a powerful retention tool, but it relies on a false binary. Teachers do not have to join a traditional strike-authorized labor union to get professional protection. Papa Bear points out the rise of independent non-union associations.
Like what?
Groups like the Association of American Educators, the AAE, or the Christian Educators Association International, CEAI.
These groups operate more like professional guilds. They exist to provide exactly what many teachers actually want: $2 million in liability insurance, legal representation for workplace disputes, and professional development resources. But they offer this without the partisan political baggage, without the massive lobbying expenditures, and crucially, without the requirement to abandon your students and go on strike if the union leadership demands it.
Which brings us to the fourth and final avenue for change, which scales all of this up: advocating for state-level education reforms. What's fascinating here is how deeply embedded union power is in state labor laws.
Like Hawksby found.
Yes, as Hawksby's data showed us, you can fight at the local school board and you can join an alternative association, but if the state law strictly enforces a monopoly on collective bargaining, your local efforts are severely capped. Systemic change requires moving up the food chain to the state legislature.
This circles back to the systemic critiques from earlier. State lawmakers are the only ones who can introduce market competition by passing sweeping charter school authorizations or universal voucher programs. When a state enacts universal school choice, it fundamentally breaks the union's monopoly on the students, and therefore its monopoly on the funding.
Furthermore, state legislatures can pass laws that mandate true transparency in union membership, outlining those manipulative 10-day opt-out windows, so membership is truly voluntary year-round.
That would change everything.
They can also ban the practice of release time, a controversial provision in many districts where union officials are paid their full taxpayer-funded teacher salary but are legally released from teaching any classes so they can conduct union business full-time. State laws can ensure that public education money only pays for public education instruction.
So we've covered a massive amount of ground regarding the flaws of the current system. We look at the Hawksby data showing incredible financial inefficiency. We explored the systemic critiques of tenure and last in first out policies. We examined the breaking point of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we discussed a sequence playbook for how to bypass or dismantle this labor monopoly.
We really have covered a lot.
But I want to pivot here, because what if the ultimate goal isn't to destroy unions entirely?
That is a crucial pivot. Because the reality is, teachers are workers. They operate in highly complex, often stressful bureaucratic environments, and workers naturally want and deserve a collective voice.
Is there a way this collective power could actually be used to benefit the students, exactly the way the unions originally claimed in the symbiotic model? Our sources introduce a fascinating, evolving paradigm called bargaining for the common good.
Bargaining for the common good is an attempt to fundamentally rewire the structural incentives of the union. Normally, collective bargaining is a closed-door, highly isolated, adversarial negotiation. It's the union lawyers on one side of the table, the district administration on the other, arguing fiercely over whether the salary schedule increases by 3% or 4%.
Right.
The parents, the students, and the taxpayers are completely locked out of the room until a strike threatens to shut down the town.
It's a zero-sum game played behind closed doors. But bargaining for the common good flips that script. Instead of isolating themselves to protect special interests, educators and their unions partner explicitly and publicly with parents, community stakeholders, and local advocacy organizations.
Exactly.
They intentionally align their interests before they ever get to the bargaining table.
It expands what labor organizers call the continuum of bargaining. Under the traditional special interest model, if a union goes on strike demanding a 5% raise in tenure after 2 years, the parents might view them as greedy and turn against them.
Right.
But if a union, utilizing the common good strategy, goes to the bargaining table and says, we demand smaller class sizes, and we demand the district hire 3 new full-time mental health counselors for our students, and we demand an end to racially biased disciplinary policies, and we demand a 5% raise to retain our best teachers, the entire political dynamic shifts.
It's brilliant from an organizing perspective. The union uses its legal right to bargain not just as a tool for adult welfare, but as a vehicle to demand structural, long-term changes for the entire community. They stop being the adversary of the public and become the heavily armed champion of the public.
Yeah.
They aren't just fighting the district for a larger slice of a static pie. They're standing arm in arm with the parents, demanding that the state bake a bigger pie for everyone.
It requires a massive, genuine cultural shift within the union leadership itself. They have to willingly abandon the special interest model and genuinely commit to the symbiotic model.
Yeah.
When contract negotiations provide an opportunity to involve the larger school community in a shared vision, the union goes on the offense towards success for the kids, the schools, and the broader civic future.
So what does this all mean? It brings us back to where we started. It means that teachers' unions aren't inherently fundamentally good or evil. They are an economic and political tool. But their historical incentive structures have often led to massive financial inefficiencies, protected gross underperformance, and caused a horrific clash of interests during crises like COVID-19.
Yeah, the incentives are the key.
To fix it, their incentives need to be forcefully realigned with the community's goals, either through the external competitive pressure of universal school choice and Jana's legal challenges, or through the internal cultural evolution of bargaining for the common good.
And that brings us to why every single detail of this mechanical breakdown matters directly to you, the listener.
Exactly. I want to talk directly to you for a second. You might be listening to this hour-long deep dive thinking, I don't have kids. I don't go to PTA meetings. I don't care about the intricacies of collective bargaining arbitration. Why does this matter to me?
That's a fair question.
It matters because whether you have a child in the system or not, you are an involuntary shareholder in this enterprise. You are funding this monopoly every time you pay your property taxes or your state income tax.
Yes, you are.
The efficiency of your local public schools directly impacts your property values. It impacts the safety, vitality, and crime rates of your local economy. And most importantly, the system we just described is actively shaping the future workforce that will operate your local hospitals, build your regional infrastructure, and vote in your state elections.
Let's briefly recap the diagnostic journey we've taken today. We started with Caroline Hawksby's rigorous empirical data, which revealed a shocking paradox.
Right.
State-mandated unionization led to massive increases in educational spending and better teacher pay, but actually increased the high school dropout rate because those resources were diverted into adult comforts rather than student outcomes.
Yep.
We explored the daily systemic frictions that cause this inefficiency, the costly defense of tenure, the stifling reality of step-in-lane meritless pay, the danger of LIFO layoffs, and the fierce politically funded lobbying against charter schools and vouchers.
And then we looked at the ultimate breaking point during the pandemic, where the union's special interest mandate to protect the adult worker actively harmed the mental, physical, and academic development of the child by keeping schools shuttered long after it was safe to open. And we explored the avenues for structural change, cutting off funding through Janus opt-outs, mobilizing local voters for school board elections, joining nonpartisan alternative associations, pushing for state-level school choice, or transforming the union's core mission through bargaining for the common good. Now, I know you have a final thought on this before we sign off.
I do. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. We've spent this entire deep dive debating how to fix, fight, regulate, or reform the teachers' union within the context of the traditional public school district.
Right.
But if public education is functionally a state-sponsored monopoly, and unions simply represent the labor force reacting to the rules of that monopoly, what would happen if the traditional school district model was abolished entirely? Oh, wow. Wait, really? Just pulling up the entire foundation of how we think about schooling in America.
Imagine a system completely decentralized. A system where educational funding doesn't go to a bureaucratic district, but goes directly to the parents in the form of an unrestricted educational savings account.
Okay.
In that landscape, teachers could operate as highly paid independent contractors, or they could form localized, teacher-owned cooperatives within a fully free marketplace of education.
That's fascinating.
In a world without a centralized district bureaucracy to fight against, would the concept of a massive, politically aggressive teachers' union even need to exist? Or would excellence naturally regulate itself, rewarding the most brilliant educators directly, while parents freely choose the optimal environment for their child-specific needs? It completely reframes the entire conversation. We started this deep dive looking for a simple diagnosis. But as we've seen, when you look at the mechanics of teachers' unions, the expenditures, the census data, and the human incentives driven by collective bargaining, it is a deeply complex, fiercely protected ecosystem. Whether that ecosystem needs surgical legislative intervention, a massive dose of free market competition, or a total holistic reimagining, one thing is absolutely certain. Simply throwing more taxpayer money into the machine without looking closely at who is legally operating the levers is a guaranteed prescription for failure. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the mechanics, keep looking closely at the structures of your local systems, and we'll see you next time.